Oh, this is going to be a great video because I turned it on already, and now I'm going to. So people are going to be like, oh. So, yes. So this is a big book, by the way, dense, lots of experiments, and his basic conclusion is that yes, it's electrical, so we have these electrical currents, which is what makes us think. So our mind is based on our brain, which basically is pretty well accepted today, even by like Steven Pinker. In fact, Steven Pinker argues specifically for that and against the idea that there's some kind of a soul that's separate from the physical brain. And this is also considered part of pragmatism. So what I've read, and since I haven't read this book, the idea that this book is really the perfect expression of pragmatism doesn't really quite make sense to me, but if you ever get a chance and read this, we'll try to get a sense that the kind of science this is kind of exemplary of pragmatism. But so he was primarily a psychologist and then a philosopher. And he got the idea of pragmatism from Charles Sanders Peirce, who introduced the concept in a lecture that he gave as a student in a club. So it was a club, the Metaphysical Club. I mentioned the book by Louis Menand, who described this metaphysical club, which met at Harvard or Lawrence Scientific Institute, whatever it was, where Charles Sanders Peirce's father taught as well. But so they knew one another. James liked the idea of pragmatism, but instead of treating pragmatism as a theory of the semiotic, using it to analyze how language works and meaning, instead he applied it to theory of knowledge. So I think I mentioned the pragmatic movement in American philosophy. Not all philosophers of the time were considered pragmatists. An important one that was not is Josiah Royce, who was absolutely fantastic. Was a graduate of Stanford, and also went to the same Hopkins University in Maryland, where John Dewey also went. But he also was invited to teach at Harvard while James was away in Edinburgh giving the lectures that are still given every year on philosophy and religion in Edinburgh, called the Gifford Lectures. That's pretty interesting too. Gifford Lectures. They're still given every year. In fact, if you go to their site, and in fact I should go to it and look up who they post as. So giffordlectures.org, natural theology. If you look at the lecturers and authors that they've given, there's different ways you can look at them, obviously. 1860 to 1907, notice they're in sequence. Hannah Arendt, that's interesting. A.J. Ayer. So you could go look, and it's almost like a list of who's who in philosophy for hundreds of years, however long they've had these lectures, because it's like they ask the most fascinating, interesting, popular, whatever speaker. So Charles Taylor, for example, Daniel Dennett, contemporary ones that are still alive, have given these lectures. And William James was the first American invited overseas to give a lecture to Europeans. So this is like, whoa, Americans? Giving a lecture to Europeans? Whoa, that was like, who ever heard of such a thing? Because after all, Americans are kind of like, they vote for Trump, Sorry, that was uncalled for. True, but, uncalled for. Sorry.
We're all deeply offended.
Thank you. That's a good sign. But, so William James gave his lecture, and the lecture he gave, which I bet there's a way to look it up. His lecture was titled The Varieties of Religious Experience, which you could still buy a new copy in the bookstore.
Isn't that a book?
It is.
Did he write?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Wow. I didn't realize that was written so long ago. Yeah.
1900. You've seen it? Read it?
Well, no, I've heard of it quite a bit, but I thought it was more...
So that's 118 years old.
Wow.
And yet, it's still a book that you could go and buy a new copy of in the bookstore because it still sells. But what is it about? He's a psychology, philosophy person, and what he's looking at religion, not from the typical viewpoint that the lectures used to be about, basically arguing what's the best religion and how do you know, and has God spoken to you lately, that kind of thing. This is instead arguing religion is good for us. Not interested in what religion is the best one or any of that sort of thing, but instead does an analysis of lots of different significant religious individuals, like Gandhi. Well, not Gandhi, sorry. Yes. Gandhi hadn't been there yet. Sorry. But it would have, I'm sure Gandhi would have been involved if James had lived long enough. I meant Buddha, and Muhammad. I'm sure you could Jesus, Moses, those kinds of folks that have had a significant impact, that had a religious experience, and then shared that with followers. Right. So that's something that he points out in the book, is that there's not really that many individuals that have had this kind of religious experience, but those that have then share this experience with lots of people, and it has a great impact. Right? But the other thing is that it's good for us, for our mental health, to believe in a religion. So he's looking at it from a psychological point of view, that faith in whatever religion turns out to be mentally good for your mental health, right? So that's the focus of his analysis of the varieties of the religious experience, that psychologically it's good for us. Which, by the way, this is something that even contemporaries like Steven Pinker address, because, when we get into arguments over religion, which he does, by the way, and he's one of those contemporary scientists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, who's dead now, may he rest in pieces. No, I'm just kidding. He's fascinating. I don't know. Have you ever heard Christopher Hitchens lecture, talk? Oh, he's vicious. But Christopher Hitchens. He died of cancer.
talk, we're going to have a Q&A session, and I'd like to remind everyone to...
They're all forbidden. No, I don't think so. I think we can actually have a better explanation in every sense. Superior, as well as better, that no one would have been able to get as far as Mount Sinai or in any other mountain in any other direction unless they had known that human solidarity demands that we look upon each other as brothers and sisters, and that we forbid activities such as murder, rape, perjury, and theft, that this is innate in us. Of those to whom it is not innate, the sociopaths who don't understand the needs of anyone but themselves, and the psychopaths who positively take pleasure in breaking these rules, well, all we can say is, according to one theory, they're also made in the image of God, which makes the image of God question rather problematic, does it not? Or that they can be explained by further and better research and have to be restrained and disciplined meanwhile. But in no sense here is religion a help where it claims to help most, which is to our morality, to our ethics. Finally, I would say, not finally because I'm finished here, I'm not quite done, don't relax. I hope everyone's got a drink, something to eat. But on the poison question, I think there's the real temptation of something very poisonous to human society and human relations, which is the fear of freedom, the wish to be slaves, the wish to be told what to do. Now, just as we all like to think, and we live under written documents and proclamations that encourage us to think that it is our birthright and our most precious need.
So, he died just relatively recently. 2011. Had cancer. But where's this list of books? He was a journalist primarily. American writing? That's interesting. They said that. Lots of different books. Lots of lectures and so on. Very, very interesting writer. So if you're interested in reading someone whose just way of writing is just absolutely amazing, he's that kind of individual. Whether you agree with him or not, right? You know. But he was one of the four so-called, what do they call the four riders of the apocalypse? The
Four horsemen.
Four horsemen of the. So they called them like the four horsemen of the, of atheism or whatever the heck. Because after 9/11, when it was interpretable easily as the Islamic fundamentalists had a war against modern civilization, these four guys basically united in their attempt to just come out and just make everybody who was associated with religion seem like they were idiots, assholes, ridicule them. So it wasn't like oh, let's be careful how we describe this, and by the way realize that there are a lot of intellectuals that are religious and have quite sophisticated arguments associated with the value of religion, as James does. I mean, James basically feels like if you're going to be socially healthy, you need to have a religion, because that's the source of morality, basically. So think about Nietzsche. When Nietzsche says, if God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted, because there's no source of morality, right? By the way, Pinker will argue an agreement with them that religion is bad, because religion is, as they interpret it, is based on faith in nonsense. That's the way they interpret it, right? It's faith in nonsense, right? Instead of science, faith and nonsense, right? And so they also talk about faith as something that you shouldn't have faith. You should want proof, right? Well, from what I think of as a more sophisticated interpretation of how language works, science is faith-based too. So I could disagree with Pinker and others. I think it's harder to disagree with Daniel Dennett because Daniel Dennett understands all that and pretty much plays properly with this as an issue, right? But their goal was to basically stop people from having a socially acceptable permission to be religious, because as far as they were concerned, those people were out there to destroy modern civilization and all the progress that we're making. I mean, obviously, if they blow up a school or shoot up a school, why? Why did they go? The guy that shot up the nightclub in Florida, apparently the reason he picked that particular nightclub was because initially he was hoping to shoot up Disney World. It was on the news yesterday. They have videos of him and his wife, and the plan was that they would bring the gun hidden in the baby stroller into Disney World, and he would shoot people up in Disney World. But the one time that he came planning on doing that, there was a heavy police presence, and he got scared off. And then he decided instead to, the Club Dido or whatever the heck it was, that he went and shot all those people, right? So what? I mean, it's not like he hated that place, or he wanted to, make an impact on our society. Why? Is his Islamic beliefs. He thought he was a warrior for Islam, right? So in that sense, this is clearly a war of Islamic believers against modern civilization and all the things associated with it, of that, right? Well, if that's the case, then what they wanted to do was totally demoralize anyone who was even teenagers, that might be attracted to such a religion, demoralize them by absolutely insulting to the max, calling them, the worst possible stupid names, etc. How could you believe such stupid things, etc. So if you ever get a chance to look at any of those lectures on it, they're just absolutely vicious. And of course, what they're trying to do is change the way the culture allows people to grow up in religions, right? Because science is the only answer. If you go to a church, and they'll talk about kind of the moderate liberal churches as being culpable, because by having such a religion and thinking that you're doing the right thing, you're actually allowing the more stupid religions to exist, which are the ones, of course. I mean, I can't imagine an Episcopalian taking it upon himself to blow up anything. For one thing, that's not the kind of thing Episcopalians would do. I'm kidding. I'm just totally. You're blushing over that. Was that? Are you Episcopalian?
I'm a little confused. I'm not Episcopalian. No.
Oh, what?
Sure, exactly what Episcopalian.
I'll explain.
Oh.
We will now sing hymn 405. Oh God, what on earth is...
So this is his interpretation of Anglicans.
Oh God, what on earth is my head? There's something weird, something phenomenally dreary about Christian singing. The gospel singers are the only singers that just go crazy, go and joyous, and it's fucking amazing. And it's born out of kidnapping, imprisonment, slavery, murder, all of that, and this joyous singing. And the Church of England, well, all those sort of Christian religions, which is mainly Caucasian white people, with all the power and money, enough power and money to make Solomon blush. And they were singing, oh God, the age is past, our hope for years. They're the only group of people that can sing hallelujah without feeling like it's a hallelujah thing. Hallelujah, hallelujah, joyfully we lock our bound.
So, sorry, actually I was Episcopalian for a while. It's when I got married. You know, the Roman Catholic Church doesn't allow priests to be married, but in the Episcopal Church, it's a good thing to have a wife. In fact, today it's a good thing for you to have a husband if you're an Episcopal priest. In fact, it's a good thing if you're an Episcopal priest to have a partner today. You know, things have changed, right? But so, as a married Roman Catholic, still interested in seminary, I switched to the Episcopal Church. That's the one that interviewed me for EDS or generals. I was interviewed for both, and I passed. I was accepted, and Bishop Ogilvie of Philadelphia was going to send me too. I was like, one of the candidates, so they would have funded me to go to seminary. But that was when Don and I discussed it and decided we didn't want to be poor, which we would essentially be. But, this is a career where your career choice was let's be poor for the rest of our lives. We decided no, let's be rich instead. So I joined the Army.
My dad is a pastor, so that rings very true.
Yeah.
You're in seminary.
Yes. So not only was I not at that point, the culture changed somehow, at least in my area of living in Philadelphia, and I realized I didn't want to just give up everything and join a monastery. Instead I wanted to have a life with all of the pleasures associated with modern living. I don't mean that in a sinful sort of way, but how I wanted a house, I wanted a family, all that kind of stuff. But you could still do it as an Episcopalian, and so I switched. And at the time, I remember thinking, the Episcopal Church is just like the Roman Catholic Church, except they don't accept the Pope, pretty much. And they also had a longer English-speaking tradition, whereas the Catholic Church, just since Vatican II, had switched from Latin to English, to the language of the community. So,
does the Episcopalian Church do confession? Or
they didn't have an official. They had confirmation. In fact, instead of being baptized as a member of the Episcopal Church, the bishop just kind of like went, "You're accepted." Yeah. They don't have hocus pocus because they don't do Latin.
Right.
So, the hocus pocus thing comes from hoc est.
Doesn't it mean I see, therefore I create, or something like that?
Hoc means this. Est means is. This is. Hoc est. Corpus meum. This is my body. At the Last Supper. And of course this could not possibly have happened because Jesus did not speak Latin. But, the consecration of the host in the Mass in Latin was hoc est corpus meum, which is then given for everyone. I don't remember the whole thing. And then hoc est sangue. meum. This is my body. This is my blood. Because then he took the cup, etc. So James is significant for looking at religion as psychologically healthy for human beings. So the arguments that we could get into over whether or not religion is good for you or whether you can live without it, right? Now that's James was very much there for that. Keep in mind, remember that he was raised in a religious family that had a religious tradition, the Swedenborgian faith. But let's talk about the theory of knowledge, right? Because the problem when you switch to Hegel, and then you go, right, because, and the pragmatists are kind of taking that Hegelian problem onward, right? The idea that there's this dialectical process. So you have a truth at a particular time, but then you have science investigate it and discover that there's something wrong with that. Maybe not that it was wrong, but that it was incomplete. So the sun doesn't go around the earth. Instead, the earth goes around the sun. Whoa, well then wait a minute, but then it switches back. So there was, you could have been persecuted for believing that, at a certain point, but then at a certain point you're laughed at for not believing it, right? Like as you grew up, I'm sure, the schools would tell you, yes, the earth goes around the sun, and anybody that comes in and says, oh, the sun goes around the earth, they're dumb. Why are they thinking that, etc. Right? Now then, with Hawking's model-dependent realism, you realize, well, there's lots of different models. All the models are true to the extent that they're useful, and it's not true to say, right? Did we do that? Did we talk about that? Did I ask you whether the Earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the Earth? Yeah. Or, does the whole shebang go around the center of the galaxy? Yes, that's true too. That's another model. On the other hand, nothing goes around anything. I mean, we have all these different models, and all the models are tools for us to be able to do. So our contemporary perspective of model-dependent realism, which basically says, okay, so these are all useful models. The only thing you could do that's a mistake is think that because this one model works beautifully in predicting these aspects of our experience, that therefore this is true and all the others are wrong. That's dumb, because instead, all the models are useful. All of them are true. Even wait a minute, you can't both believe this and yes. How do you do that? Relativism, in the sense that this is true, this is true. By the way, relativism in that sense, rightly understood, why is it so difficult? Actually, it's not relativism, it's postmodern. Rightly understood. But the problem there, too, is that postmodernism is associated with relativism, right? This is an excellent book on postmodernism, by the way. And in fact, I've met the author. He came here and gave a lecture. I'm not sure he's still alive, though. I forget. But in any case, he was a friend of Jim Muller, who had been the chair of the political science department. I think Forrest Neighbors is now the chair of the department, but Jim is still here and teaches. Being the chair of a department is kind of like a sacrifice. Most people that I know would much rather not have to be the chair, because what it means, you give up one class a semester, but you have to attend so many stupid bureaucratic business things that it eats up your time tremendously, and there's no real benefit to it if you've got tenure, etc. It's not like you're earning something special, etc. So it's like a sacrifice. So most departments, if they have the members, will rotate it so that no one person has to be the chair all the time, but can, get back to, etc. But in any case, so Professor Lawler was here, and I had read this book prior to his coming, so it was kind of nice to meet him and everything. But the main point that he does really well in the book, and the emphasis here, is that within the particular language game, as Wittgenstein calls it, or context, you have truths that are true. If you accept that the Earth goes around the sun, as it does, it really does do that, right? Then you have to figure out the speed, the rotation, the axis, how the sun warms the various parts of the, all these elements all fit together in a way that you can study them and say, yes, that's why we don't get enough vitamin D, because of the position we're on, etc. All that stuff. All of those things are factual. So you can study them scientifically, learn more about them, and be absolutely certain about these within that context. So to say, okay, well, it's also true that the sun goes around the earth. None of that stuff is now held in disbelief. That whole context is true, right? But what are you looking at when you're saying, oh, okay, so the sun goes around the earth? Well, if I'm standing here and I know when the sun is due to come up and then where it goes, I can, of course, calculate where the sun is based on that model. And that works beautifully for figuring out. And by the way, if I'm trying to figure out how I'm moving from point A to point B on an Earth that's spinning in space and going around the sun, do I have to calculate that, how do I keep my position on the Earth? If I'm moving, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, do I have to counter? No, I don't have to worry about that. In other words, there's all this aspects of our psychological behavior that's still based on of course the sun goes, right? We still say the sun, rises today at such and sets at such and such. We have 13 hours of sun today, That's still the way they talk, of course, as if, well, you can't email Jackie Purcell and say, Jackie, since Galileo, we haven't treated the sun as actually rising. That doesn't work. You should clean up your act. No, she would just be furious at you. She's not really a nice person.
Who?
Jackie Purcell.
You're not the first person I've heard that from.
Yeah. She yelled at me once at Sears.
Who is that?
I sold her a phone. Jackie Purcell?
Yeah, who is that?
People from all over the state are coming to this year's Rondi Festival. As you can see, expect most of the crowds to be coming from the interior and into the south central region.
Jackie, there's nothing behind you.
Moving on.
Is she a news anchor?
Weather.
Weather. Oh, okay.
Sorry. I mentioned her because I thought everyone would immediately recognize her.
I recognize the name.
I think I've heard it before, but I would have never connected it to the person.
I mean, there's other aspects of these models too. So when you think of postmodernism, rightly understood, as Lawler points out, you don't think that relativism means nothing is true. I mean, that's usually the way people criticize postmodernism or relativism, by arguing that, well, if you're a relativist, then it's kind of like Nietzsche, everything is permitted. No. You still have other reasons besides believing in God for thinking it's not good to kill other people, or put cholera in the water, of a community, or blow up a school, or threaten somebody, right? I mean, there's other biologically based reasons for being moral, sociologically based reasons for being moral. If you're thinking about how we could have a thriving polis, as Aristotle would say, right? Then there are certain things that the polis should do. Different kinds of laws that we should have, etc. I think Christopher Hitchens was talking about that briefly in the little segment that I had running. I forget. So there are truths within a context. What's powerful about relativism in this sense is that you have the other tools, and you have the truths in those tools as well. And in fact, you could discover, as astronomers did, that, gosh, the universe is bigger than we thought. The tectonic way that the plates move, tectonics, right, or whatever right. I've not really studied a whole lot about it, but yeah, when you look at how they move, why the mountains are moving up an inch or so every year, roughly, and why we have the earthquakes when we do, and where they are, etc. I mean, all of that has improved as people have learned more and more about these sciences, right? So you could say that relativism, on the one hand, helps us be more powerful when it comes to accumulating these tools, so that we can actually be aware of all of this stuff. On the other hand, until something has been demonstrated to be wrong, in error, it's good to believe it, right? Well, if truth changes that way, the problem that the pragmatists began to have with knowledge was that people have a natural tendency, at least I think it was even stronger then, to feel that if something was true, that it was true. So there was no changing it, right? And you were basically wrong for doing it. I remember the fight that C.S. Lewis had over the idea that meanings of words changed, right? He wrote a book titled Words, C.S. Just remember it as Words, Studies in Words. His point was that when you go to school and you get a good education, the teacher teaches you what the proper meanings of words are, and once you learn those, now you've become an educated person, and you can speak meaningfully, correctly. Well, but at the same time, there was a movement in British education. In fact, this book was written against a particular textbook that had been adopted by some of the schools in England that accepted the idea that the meanings of words adapt, evolve, change, which we've accepted completely, by the way, I think. I don't think anyone, I mean, we can understand that becomes a problem, because you feel like, well, the words in a contract have to be interpreted correctly. Otherwise, if you break the contract, you could be in trouble. It says, according to the contract, you will not mention your affair with Donald Trump. Or if you do, for each time you break the contract, you will be fined $1 million. And, well, guess what? She said 20 different things about this out in the press, so therefore you owe Donald Trump $20 million. That's the lawsuit, right? And by the way, that was before she did the interview on 60 Minutes. So that's kind of, how many more millions, is she going to owe based on the contract? On the other hand, is that a legal contract? We will find out, I suppose.
Apparently he even makes his staff sign non-disclosure.
The threat, of course, was another issue. But so, according to contract law, lawyers, what do? They sit there and negotiate or argue about the specific meaning of the contract. And the meanings of the law. What do these words mean? So to some extent, it's absolutely essential that the words persist over time, that the legal meanings persist over time. Of course, if you go to the OED, which everybody knows, right? The OED, it's like the official source. What's it going to give me if I do it?
Oh, okay.
No, I don't have an account. Go away, right? It used to come out in a book or even a multi-volume set. One of my colleagues years ago had it was a box. It came like in a bureau for the book, and below that was like a drawer that you would open that had the magnifying glass that you needed in order to read anything in the book, because the print was so small, because it was just a one-volume OED, abridged, of course. But if you think about it, you could go to this and they will list all the variants of the meaning of the word, right? So they just keep accumulating them. But you can obviously imagine the difficulties we have here. I mean, just thinking of some of the simple words like, that's hot, that's cool, that's neat, when I was in college, one of my courses was philosophy of language, and we had one text by Ziff on the meaning of words. I think it was titled Carl Ziff. Semantics. No. Let's see if I have. That's not it. Oh well, whatever. I have it at home, but so the whole point of our class, at least it seemed, was to spend the whole semester, 18 weeks, trying to figure out what the word "good" meant. And our task, it was like a laboratory kind of experiment. We had to figure out all the different ways in our society that people use the word "good" and record them all and try to figure out what the word "good" means. Well, it's kind of an interesting experiment because, of course, it teaches you that it's constantly fluctuating. So we don't really argue the point that C.S. Lewis was making at the time. That's the old fuddy-duddy, professorial view that there's only one way to wear your collar, et cetera. Wittgenstein kind of flaunted that too. By the way, he was the one that took off his tie and opened his collar, and yet still was a professor. Yeah. He was also the person who invented the head slap. That kind of. It's like recorded that he's the one. He's the one that did that. now it's, I guess Homer Simpson's the one that's most famous for it. Doe of Simpson, or Homer. So, the pragmatists changed the concept of truth to solve the problem. And the argument was that instead of talking about something being true, they used instead the concept of a warranted assertion. Instead of saying that such and such is true, instead, a pragmatist, John Dewey was a pragmatist but also an instrumentalist, as he argued that knowledge is an instrument. And it's ongoing. It's self-correcting. You know, we have a process of inquiry. And by the way, for Dewey, the process of inquiry was this dialectical process. As Hegel gives us this dialectic, guess what? That's how teaching ought to be, says Dewey. Hegel didn't talk about that, but Dewey did. So notice my argument about how Hegelianism kind of really blossomed under American thinking, and that's another way you could see how that happened. So we come up with a warranted assertion, which is based on, I have a hypothesis, this is the case, rather than saying that this is true, which, when you say this is true, people become psychologically fixed and want to continue to believe that. It's almost like, as they talk about today, that people base their political identity on certain vocabulary, the way they say certain things, so they take sides based on kind of who speaks this way. That's the way I speak about these issues versus this group that speaks this way. So who I am, in a sense, is based on the way I speak and the way my associates speak, right? So I have a political identity that, it's us against you kind of thing. Well, rather than thinking in terms of true or false, instead you have something that's warrantedly assertable, based on, I know it's a foot-long deal, but the idea, of course, is I can, based on our studies, our experience, our experiments, our data, I can assert that this is, our currently accepted hypothesis based on this data. Notice there's this open-endedness to it, that, wow, but if we get other, information, oh, wow, let's update our information then. We'll update the database, etc. Right? That's, I have no hostility towards that. In fact, I'm looking forward to it. When do we find more information, we'll know even more why cancer of the blood cells occurs. Is it because of this? Is it because of this? If you look at a book that was absolutely fantastic, it was called why do I not remember the name of the book? Shoot, it's about cancer, about the history of cancer. Are you familiar? Mukherjee is the author. That's totally not how you spell his name. Mukherjee, there it is. No, not Rani though. What the heck is the name of it? The Emperor of Maladies. It's history of cancer. It outlines exactly how step by step by step by step up until whenever the book came out, that cancer was understood better and better and better and better. I think the newest one he has out is The Gene. I don't know when these have come out. He's a great writer too, by the way. So he's another one I recommend.
Well, I've never known of, like, I know that some people are named like Jesus or Muhammad, but I've never like heard of anyone being named Siddhartha. Is that something
It's
that
like
happens
Joe
a lot?
Smith in India.
Huh?
It's like Joe Smith in India.
Really? Wow. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Buddha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I heard that name, I'm like, I know who that is. I cannot say.
So I need a good quiz question. So how about this? Do you think it's true that do you think it's true that pragmatism is the way Americans are raised to philosophically think? That's too long and confusing. Are we pragmatists? Are Americans raised to be pragmatists? The idea of is that true was a joke.
Is it warranted?
Is it a warranted assertion?
That Americans
Can
are
you
pragmatists?
explain pragmatism again?
So it's like being really practical.
Yeah, isn't it
It's
like
just
kind of
another word
do-it-yourself
for
spirit? Like do-it-yourself sort of ethic.